Grit is what I've been studying for now over a dozen years. If you count when I started my PhD program, I was 32, coming out of the classroom as a teacher and trying to do what I couldn't do when I was in the classroom, which is understand effort. I mean, I could exhort effort. I could lecture at my students that they should work harder. I could explain to them that it was in their interest and mine. But I couldn't understand why they sometimes did work hard and long and get somewhere, and why irrationally too often they didn't. And so that's what got me into studying this topic more formally as a psychologist. I primarily use questionnaires in my research, which, as Kate and I can tell you, doesn't mean that I think we should be grading kids on grit. These research instruments that have questions on them like, I am a hard worker, or my interests change from year to year, are your own judgment of yourself. And that judgment can be, faked. That judgment can also be influenced by your role models, and what you think it means to be a hard worker can vary dramatically from school to school. That said, I think this research instrument has usefully advanced our understanding of effort, and in particular grit. This is a graph of grit scores as a function of age. You can find yourself on the x-axis. If you're in your 20s, you're on the left, lower grit scores. If you're in your 60s, you're on the right. And if you're in the 70s, I hardly even have data, except for those people that I've surveyed are really gritty. So there's cross-sectional evidence that grit is not fixed. There's cross-sectional evidence that how gritty you are today isn't necessarily how gritty you're going to be tomorrow or next year. I have a little video of Will Smith, and since it's Monday morning and raining out, I think it would be fun to have him speak on behalf of grit.
Thing that I see that is distinctly different about me is I'm not afraid to die on a treadmill, right? I will run.
You would not be outworked.
I will not be outworked,
right?
Period.
Yeah.
You might have more talent than me, you might be smarter than me, you might be sexier than me, you might be all of those things. You got it on me in 9 categories. But if we get on the treadmill together, right, there's 2 things. You're getting off first, or I'm going to die. It's really that simple.
I'm not going to go on too long. I want to set the stage for a conversation, but let me just try to put Will's comments on his own success in historical context. So it was in 1869 that Sir Francis Galton did the first scientific study of achievement. And after reviewing the biographies of eminent individuals from commerce to sports to arts and music, Galton concluded that talent or ability is in fact very important to achievement, but that there were 2 other things as well: zeal and the capacity for hard work. In my words, passion and perseverance. Now, Galton's somewhat more well-known and also nicer cousin, Charles Darwin, wrote back to Galton after reading his report and said, I've always maintained that individuals did not differ much in their intellectual ability, but only in their zeal and hard work. In the letter, Darwin says, you've made a case that maybe there's some small role for differences in talent. But how does Darwin close the letter? He says this: I still maintain that zeal and the capacity for labor make the most important difference. And that is why I study grit, so that I can understand where this comes from. Where is it that we find the ability or the inclination to sustain our interests so that we're pointing in the same direction day after day, and that we sustain our effort despite big setbacks, and frankly, despite those little daily setbacks that can be just as hard to get over. And I do believe that talent plays a role in achievement, but I think effort counts twice. And here's why. If you think about your talent, you can think about it as how quickly you get better at things. My guess is that in our room here, you're the kind of person who gets better at words You know, you can hear things, like you can hear a sentence that's too long or a little clunky. And my guess is that when it comes to writing, your skills improve pretty quickly. And then I would say you're talented in writing. But without effort, that potential to get better in writing is merely just that, potential. So you need effort to kind of unlock your talent and turn it into skill. Try really hard for a while with some talent, and you'll become a skilled writer. But you still have to produce, as all your editors will tell you. So if you've got this terrific skill, but you decide not to write the next article or the next book, then there too, your skill lies fallow. So effort counts twice because it turns talent into skill, and it turns skill into tangible achievement. I'll say more in our Q&A about what I think we know from science beyond what Will Smith can tell us. But here's a graph to motivate that conversation. If you fast forward all the way to 2016, this is what we know about how experts get to where they are. It is not by magic. It is by ascending a tortuously long, tedious, and in some ways mundane learning curve from where they start, which is just like the rest of us, not knowing very much, to where they end up, which is world class. Many people, I would argue most of us, plateau at arrested development. We are fine. We can conjugate a subject and a verb. We can get ourselves to where we need to be. Nobody fires us. But we're not excellent, and we're certainly not continuously improving. And here's what I worry about, particularly when I think about the kids that I taught in New York City, the kids that I taught in San Francisco and in Philadelphia, that for many young people, they're not even on the plateau of arrested development. They've dropped out. And what happens to human skill when you drop out of high school, you drop out of your college program, or you quit the track team, or you stop playing piano, is that your skills atrophy. You don't get to keep them. They basically regress to zero. So I'll stop there and just say that I have more to say about what deliberate practice feels like and the psychology of showing up. And I want to save this time for you because I think in this room, maybe more than any other on my book tour, which starts, well, it started 17 minutes ago, I think you know more about grit than anyone, so I don't want to waste your time, but I very much want to hear your questions.
So I really love that opening and how like the framing was like talent, grit, and passion. And I know your work a little, but I don't know it super well, and I know like a lot about flow, and like, so I want to know where zeal fits in the grit picture.
Yeah, so yeah, I love this question, right? so there is a literature on experts that argues that deliberate practice, typically meted out in, just to give you a sense of this, because I think everybody in this room probably wants to be a better writer, right? How good you are. So the recommendation from deliberate practice would be that between 3 to 5 hours a day, if you're truly a world-class performer, that's all you can take, of deliberate practice is what you need to do. It's the following. You have to have clear stretch goals for improvement. You know, like I'll give you Benjamin Franklin as an example. Benjamin Franklin's dad told him that he was not the best writer in town and that he would never be the best writer in town, which made Benjamin Franklin very much want to be the best writer in town. So he took essays from The Spectator, and he would read them, and then he would put them in a drawer and try to rewrite them, and then he would take them out again and see how close he could get to excellence. But just the point about deliberate practice I want to make is that it's very, very specific. So not only did Benjamin Franklin do that, he would sometimes tailor that practice to, I'm only going to worry about structure of the argument. So he would even cut the page up into sentences and then reorder to get the best structure, the best skeleton, and then, again, match it to the model of excellence. That's step number one. Second is full concentration and effort. Full concentration and effort, not sort of also thinking about what to make for dinner, or I'm occasionally toggling to check my email. Third is feedback. Feedback from your editor, but I think when you're a writer, like feedback from yourself, because you can hear it, right? Like you can see, you know, you're your own editor, like in your own head. So feedback from another person or from yourself. And fourth, reflection and refinement. Those are the steps of deliberate practice, but here's the controversy and how I want to get back to flow. What does it feel like? Well, if you ask Anders Ericsson, who's a collaborator and friend, and really the pioneer in deliberate practice, and don't tell my editor, but his book, Peak, is amazing, and you should review it and read it. Yeah, don't tell my editor, I'll get murdered. But it's fantastic. It's really, it's fantastic. Anders will tell you that deliberate practice sucks, that it's extraordinarily painful, that it's aversive, it makes you anxious, it sometimes makes you bored. It can even make you bored and anxious at the same time, which seems impossible, but if you've written, you know exactly what I mean. And the controversy is this. There's another perspective, which is flow is characteristic of experts. You know, you're in the moment, it's like music, you know, you're just meeting your challenges in a way that time almost seems to be distorted. So which is it? Is it like flow, or is it kind of the opposite of flow? Well, science doesn't have an answer for that. I try to say what we know. I try to give these two perspectives. Here's where I stand today. I think for most kids, they're not going to expect, they shouldn't expect flow when they're really getting better at what they do. At some point, they might become like the Jedi Master swim coach that I interviewed, or Josh Waitzkin, the kid from Searching for Bobby Fischer, who after a lifetime, and it really is after about 3 decades of doing deliberate practice, have somehow figured out how to turn it into flow. But I think mostly my message for kids is that when you feel frustrated and when you feel bored, it doesn't mean that you're stupid, and it doesn't mean that you can't have an interest in this. These are the emotions of learning. It's not only normal, it's great.
Some of us yesterday saw the film Paper Tigers, which is about toxic stress, and the proposed solution to that is to build resiliency in kids. And I was resiliency. And I was wondering if you could say what the relationship or the distinction is between grit and resiliency.
A lot of people ask me whether grit and resilience are exactly the same thing. I think it depends on how you use the word resilience. You know, nobody has a patent on words. I certainly don't have a patent on grit, so, you know, nor do I want one. So if you're not using them synonymously, then how are they different? I don't use grit and resilience synonymously, but I think resilience is part of, not all of grit. I think of grit as not only being resilient in the face of stress or adversity, but also having a passion about something. So you can be a resilient person who doesn't have something that, you know, like a compass guides what they do, that gives meaning to all of the, you know, everyday things that are on the to-do list. So without passion, you can't be gritty, but without passion, you can be resilient. Lastly, I'll say this. I don't know if there's anybody in education who doesn't know about Carol Dweck's work by now. That's deserved, really. I can tell you, like that, there is like, if you ask like whether growth mindset is a fad, growth mindset is not a fad. That is like rock solid to the bottom. And the connection to resilience and grit is this. You know, if you ask, as I said that I entered psychology to do, the question of can we unpack the psychology of effort? Can we understand it rather than just admonish children to do what we want them to do? Carol Dweck's an example of how far we can go. If you ask the question, what is the science of resilience? Even if it's not all of grit, it's a big part of grit. We've known for 50 years what it is when somebody gives up hope. We understand much more about the neurobiology of that. And Carol's work in particular illuminates the fact that beliefs about how the world works and human nature, either that things are fixed and therefore out of your control, or that they're potentially malleable, these things can be changed, and they have unbelievable effects on downstream motivation and effort. So in sum, resilience is part of grit in the way I'm using the words, and not only that, we know a heck of a lot more about resilience than I think Aristotle would have ever been able to predict.
It seems all the people in the beginning of the book are really self-motivated, very intrinsically driven to pursue whatever is this passion with great perseverance. So my question is, how do we translate that, your findings, to the classroom where kids are told what to study, or even in homes where, you know, maybe the parent signs the kid up for the soccer team or says, try this. You know, if you're making a child do something, how much of the research on the importance of grit actually conveys, and what would you advise to adults working with children?
Yeah, I think it's really important to consider 2 things in answer to your question. The first is that when you study a mature paragon of grit, so today at noon I'm gonna go over to the Garden and interview Brad Stevens. Like so for the non-sports fans, he's a basketball coach for the Celtics. I guess the basketball coach for the Celtics. That's how much I know about sports. I'm like, is it a basketball coach or the basketball? Apparently there's only one per team. or the head one. And if you look at his biography, you could say, oh, well, he's a paragon of grit. Like, he's completely passionate and persevering. How do we get our kids to that? Well, dig a little deeper, because if you ask the people who worked with Brad when he was in high school, and even in college, and even a few years beyond college, they say, you know, it would be really nice to tell you this romantic story about how he was always that way, but he wasn't. He was just a kid, kind of not knowing what he wanted to do, not knowing that he even wanted to be a coach when he grew up. And so this first thing that I want to say is that we should have realistic expectations of what we expect for kids at their developmental stage. And when I try to reverse engineer from people like Brad Stevens or Will Smith, it's not that I feel like we should expect them to be, you know, very small versions of this grown-up. You know, if you ask a butterfly, what were you like when you were little? They might think they were a little butterfly, but they were not a little butterfly, they were a caterpillar. And so I think that's the first thing I want to say. Kids should not have, you know, interests that are sustained for years and years when they're in 4th grade. Not most of them, anyway. Second thing is, well, how do you get there? If it's developmental, what can you say? Here's the thing that I'll summarize from my own experience as a mother of now a 13-year-old and a 14-year-old girl, and again, as a teacher in the classroom and as a scientist. I think kids need choice, but they do need some guardrails. In my family, we call it the hard thing rule. The guardrail is you have to pick something what is truly hard in the sense that it requires deliberate practice. And we imposed that rule even when they were in kindergarten. So just something that would require them to try to do something a little better with focus and feedback and do the whole thing over and over again. The second part of the hard thing rule is that you can't quit. That's another guardrail. You can't quit, comma, until the season is over or the tuition payment is up. You have to fulfill your commitments. Even when my kids were in elementary school, I taught them that it was very important in our family to finish what you begin. And I think students need their teachers to show them that. The third part is gets back to choice, and this is the final part of the hard thing rule in our family, which is that nobody gets to choose your hard thing but you. And so it's fine if you quit track at the end of the season, as my younger daughter did. It's fine if you quit ballet, which she also did. It's fine to quit violin, which she also did. It's fine to quit gymnastics, which she also did. She quit all of those things at the end of the season, and she chose her next hard thing. And I actually have on my phone a little video of her that says, "Hi, I'm Lucy Duckworth. I'm gritty about viola and track," which she went back to. So I think that's what I would hope, you know, not for the kids of privilege, which I admit my kids are, but really for all kids.
What are the specific classroom interventions that you recommend?
So the question was about what are the specific classroom interventions you can recommend to encourage grit or to grow grit, I guess?
Yeah, well, I have a friend in the audience, Steve Mancini, who's been working with the KIPP schools for a long time, and one of the questions he asked me a few weeks ago was whether on this book tour we should go to a school that's doing, you know, the grit stuff, right? Like an example of, you know, the grit curriculum in action. And I said there isn't one. Because we're not there yet, unfortunately, right? So I have recommendations, you know, to an individual teacher or to an individual parent, or frankly, I tried to write, you know, maybe you'll agree with me. If you write well, then students should be able to read your work too, right? Because there's nothing great about long words. So I think my book could be read by somebody of like a 6th grade reading level, and so I wrote it for kids too, but I don't have a curriculum yet. Here's one specific recommendation that I can make, but it's not yet a full curriculum. I think that one of the things I just talked to you about deliberate practice, should inform how teachers think about their instruction. So when you send your kids home with their term paper assignment, or you even assign math homework that's due the very next day, as a teacher, you should ask yourself, is there a clear learning goal that's very specific, and do my students really know it? Do they have any strategy to remove distractions so they can really concentrate 100%? Am I giving them feedback, or am I giving them their essays back 3 months from now with no comments on them? Am I giving them feedback as a math teacher, or am I withholding the answer key because I don't want them to cheat on their homework? You know, those kinds of questions. And finally, as a teacher, am I encouraging repetition and refinement, or when you turn in your math test or your term paper, is it over? Because if your grade is sort of done, then all those comments that you might write on the page, there's no incentive to read them. If you say you could turn this in for partial credit for an improvement, if you do this math assignment again and you correct the things that you got wrong, I'll give you some points back. It's not a curriculum. It's not a school that I can take you to and it's like, oh yeah, they're doing grit. But I do think these insights, when they're applied to kind of even everyday instructional practice, can calibrate in a way what teachers are already doing well.
A couple criticisms, there's the common criticism of grit, that it's this notion that we're asking kids to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and we're ignoring systemic issues. I've also heard this idea that whether it's what you intend or not, what gets communicated or received is different in different contexts, and that children from difficult backgrounds who have difficult outside of school circumstances might be receiving these messages differently than a child of privilege, and that talking about grit in terms of extracurricular activities ignores the grit that they develop just getting to the school building every day, that that's a repeated difficult task and that that's nurturing character. I'm wondering if you've thought at all about how this message and this school culture needs to be culturally sensitive, needs to be sensitive to those environments, and if I'm in a high poverty school in a difficult area, if I talk about this differently than a school with a lot of privileged kids.
So I'm going to interject just before this. So I have written about this, and so I'm very familiar with the range of criticism on this whole notion. Another criticism as well, we're expecting kids to just be gritty and get through that really boring class. If schools are uninspirational, we should expect schools to be inspirational on top of it. I will say that having read the full book, I do think that Angela handles a lot of these issues. You'd get a much more nuanced picture from the entire book, but having said that, I'll let the author herself answer.
Thank you. No, I completely agree with the question. I also, of course I do. I'm like, that's what that's why my husband made me write the book, because he felt that, and I had to agree. It gets back to what Carol wrote in her essay about false growth mindset. The last thing that Carol Dweck wanted to happen was for mindset to be yet another scapegoat. Like, well, it's not my fault. I'm teaching you what I need, but it's your fault because you don't have a growth mindset. It's like, let's blame kids for something else, right? Here's what I think it all boils down to. Well, you can call it character, you can call it grit, you can call it social emotional skills. I don't care what you call it, right? None of these things are scapegoats, because the whole point of the grown-ups in the room is that it's our responsibility to get our kids to where they need to be. So if you want to say, well, you've got a fixed growth, you've got a fixed mindset, not a growth one, or you lack grit and you should have it, the very next sentence should be, what can I do to help you get there? Kids do not become gritty and optimistic and emotionally intelligent and anything else that we want them to be without the teachers and the other people in their life helping them be there. I thought that my own kids, when I had them, would just spontaneously become like me. You know what I mean? I just feed them and then they would. That's not how it works. And I just want to end with this about my kids, who I consider to be of privilege, and the kids that I taught, who were most certainly not. You're absolutely right that there needs to be sensitivity. There needs to be empathy. Let's use that word. When somebody comes to school and their life is shit. Okay, is shit okay? Okay. So you know what I mean? And they didn't eat, and people are mean to them all the time. You have to be empathic. You have to understand what the heck's going on in their life. But I really believe at the end of the day, when it's dangerous to start talking about our kids and their kids. Because at the core, kids are kids. And yes, their circumstances are dramatically different, and no, they shouldn't be that way. But when I see kids, I really try to think of them as I would my own, and not categorize them as oh, kid of poverty, my kid, because they're at the bottom, they are kids, and they struggle with many of the same things.